Luckily, Chapter 4 is a little bit easier to comprehend for first-time students than Chapter 3 is. Once you get the supply and demand down, consumer and producer surplus are a piece of cake. At least I hope they are. So this chapter we're going to be talking about surplus, specifically consumer and producer surplus as it relates to supply and demand and equilibrium, and what total surplus is. So a consumer's willingness to pay is the maximum price at which he or she would pay for that good. Now that makes sense. And this individual consumer surplus is the difference between what the buyer paid to what the actual willingness to pay is, or vice versa. So you subtract the price paid from the willingness to pay. So we'll see here the book example of the demand curve for used textbooks. We have a few students here: Alicia, Brad, Claudia, Darren, Edwina. I'm not sure where this book gets all these names, but that's all right. So you'll see that Alicia has a consumer or a willingness to pay 59, Brad is at 45, Claudia's at 35, and so on. That is the most they are willing to pay for that good, in this case textbooks. So total consumer surplus is the sum of all of the consumer surpluses. Now the best way to see this, I think, is just through the graph. When you see, okay, the price of textbooks is set at $30. That means Claudia has a consumer surplus of $5. She was willing to pay $35, but she only had to pay $30. So that amount is her consumer surplus. You could see the same for Brad and Alicia, who were willing to pay a lot more for this book. Maybe they didn't, people have different tolerance levels for prices. You can see at the price of $30, Darren and Edwina did not buy the book at all. So there's no consumer surplus there. If you take Alicia's, Brad's, and Claudia's consumer surplus, add it together, you get the total consumer surplus of $49 at the selling price of $30. So this shaded area is the total consumer surplus. Now, if you see that at a larger market sense, you'll see the book gives the iPad as an example. Here's the demand curve for an iPad. If the price of an iPad is $500, the consumer surplus is this shaded area. There are consumers at the quantity of up to 1 million iPads sold that were willing to pay anything from 500 up to, it doesn't say here, but I think it was 2,000 or something in the book. So all of this taken together is the consumer surplus. So there are changing prices will change consumer surplus. And for this example, we'll use a fall in the price of the goods. So a fall in the price of textbooks would increase consumer surplus because there would be more consumers who are going to buy the book at a lower price, but then there's going to be additional consumer surplus from those consumers who would have bought the book anyway. Let's see that in graphical form so it makes a little more sense, I think. So the original price of $30 and the new price of $20 for the textbook. You will see that Darren's consumer surplus is the new consumer here from the original to the new price, whereas Claudia, Brad, and Alicia already would have bought the book, but there's additional consumer surplus. They would have bought the book or Alicia would have bought at 59 or 45, 35, 30, 25, and even at 20 she would have bought this book. So the difference between what she would have paid and what she did pay is her consumer surplus, and the difference here is the increase in consumer surplus. And you'll see it here in the larger market sense as well. So if the iPad for some reason was priced at $2,000, which is an insane price for an iPad, you would have this amount of consumer surplus. If it dropped in price to $500, you would get consumer surplus from new buyers, but then you would also have the increase in consumer surplus from the original buyers. When calculating all this, it really does help to have your was it algebra or geometry rather? Sorry, geometry training in hand, because hopefully everyone knows how to calculate the area of a triangle here, of a right triangle. That's 1/2 times base times height. So base times height would give you that square. 1/2 of that would give you this triangle. I'm pretty sure you're going to have to learn how to calculate these for a homework assignment or even a test. As you can imagine, since there is a consumer surplus, there also is a producer surplus. And of course, that has to deal with the supply curve and as well as the potential seller's cost. And that's the lowest price at which he or she is willing to sell a good. So let's see that on the graph again, because that's a little easier to understand, I think. You have Andrew, Betty, Carlos, Donna, and Engelbert. Engelbert, huh? Anyway, they are willing to sell their textbook at these prices. Andrew would be willing to sell at 5, Betty at 15, and so on and so forth, with Engelbert, who really does not want to part with this book unless it's $45. And you will see at the price of $30, Carlos, Betty, and Andrew are all going to have producer surplus because they are selling their books at $30. Donna and Engelbert are going to hold on for a higher price and not sell their book. Once you understand the idea of consumer surplus, I would hope producer surplus would be really easy for you to determine. It's just kind of flipped. It's on the seller's angle. So it's the exact same concept when there's a change in the price of a good. You'll see an increase in price here from 5 to 7. You'll see an increase in the producer surplus from the original sellers who are going to sell it at $5 anyway. And you will also see producer surplus gained by new sellers. You'll have to calculate this area of base times height for the rectangle as well as for 1/2 times base times height for this triangle when you are actually calculating something. And again, it's just like the demand curve and consumer surplus, only it's flipped around since it's the supply curve. So if you add producer and consumer surplus, you will get, voila, total surplus, which is at the equilibrium price. Total surplus is simply consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So the book also wants to make note of equilibrium and why the equilibrium price is the most efficient way for consumer and producer surplus to be. So there's 3 ways where you might want to try to increase the total surplus, all of which would fail. If you tried to reallocate the consumption among consumers, if you tried to reallocate sales among sellers, or you tried to change the quantity traded, none of these would increase surplus if price is already at market equilibrium. Remember, equilibrium is the market clearing price. So let's say you're at equilibrium and you have this area of consumer and producer surplus. If you tried to reallocate consumption, you would lose this surplus taken away from Anna, given to Bob, it would be gone. If you tried to reallocate sales, there would be a loss in producer surplus. If Yvonne, who didn't want to sell the book at $30, was forced to sell the book. It's kind of go back, if you reallocate consumption, someone was forced to buy the book at a price that they didn't want to. And changing the quantity also lowers total surplus. If you could see at this quantity here, Anna, I believe, and Xavier, Anna would get more value out of the book than Xavier would selling it. There's this loss of surplus here if you change the quantity to whatever quantity this is. If you put the quantity over here, I forget who Y was, but Y would have more of a surplus than B would sell it or buying it. So there's this void here that is only filled when there's equilibrium. So if you've tried to force this quantity here, there'd be a loss in total surplus. Or if you tried to force this transaction, and if you tried to force this transaction, or if you tried to prevent this transaction, there would be this loss in total surplus. And I think that really covers everything with Chapter 4. Again, if you have any questions about consumer or producer surplus or anything else in Chapter 4, please feel free to ask. And hopefully you all learned a little something in Chapter 4.